Okay, so this is the second video in the Unit 2 playlist over properties of matter. So the first thing that we're going to go over is how are chemical and physical properties different. So physical properties are properties that you can observe without a chemical reaction. So you can actually see these properties about a substance without changing its identity. Now, chemical reactions, these are basically properties that describe a substance's ability to react with something else. So you kind of need to have a chemical reaction occur in order to see these kinds of properties. So the next thing I want to go over is how does matter change? There are two types. There's physical change and chemical change. Physical change actually occurs without changing the identity of the substance. So good examples of this are tearing, ripping, grinding, a change in the state of matter. These are all types of physical change that we will discuss in class tomorrow. Now, chemical change is obviously when a chemical reaction has occurred. So there are a couple of things that will give you a sign that a chemical reaction has occurred, like a color or odor change, the production of a gas, and giving off heat or light, and sometimes even sound will be a clue that a chemical change has occurred. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to go over for this video is extensive versus intensive properties. You have already discussed properties of matter before. This is just a different way of dividing those properties up. So make sure you get these definitions down, and we will go over this in a lot more detail in class tomorrow. So the first type is extensive properties, which are properties that depend on the amount of substance that you have. So if those properties change because you have either doubled the amount or half the amount of substance that you have, then those would be extensive properties. Some examples of that very quickly would be like mass. Obviously, if you double the size of something, that's going to change the mass. Volume is another good example. Anything referring to the size of something would also be extensive. Now, intensive, those are properties that are independent of the amount that you have. So you can just remember that for the two I's. Intensive is independent of the amount, meaning if you change the amount of substance that you have, that property is not going to change. So an example of that would be like density or the color of something. If you double or half the amount of something that you have, the color is not going to change. Texture, there's a lot of examples of intensive properties, and we'll look at this more closely tomorrow. Okay, so in this video, just to summarize what we've covered, we've discussed how are chemical properties and physical properties different. We'll also go over some examples of those in class. Next thing we talked about was how does matter actually change. You definitely need to understand the difference between physical and chemical change. And then the very last thing were two new terms that are going to be very, very important: extensive versus intensive properties.